Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. For most of you, the last day of the course. I'm just presenting the members of the table, and then we will move forward and we will see the dynamics. So, first of all, thank you to esglobal and the US Embassy for organizing this program of defense for students at the university. And with us, we have Cristina Manzano from esglobal. She will be the one moderating the table. And then we have two very good speakers, Kevin Daucher from the US Embassy, brought by the US Embassy on behalf of NATO. And then we have Sonia Andolz, that maybe some of you already know. She's a teacher here at our university, at our faculty, also a friend of mine, but I'm not a very good expert on these issues. And today we'll be speaking about the NATO's partnership with Ukraine and Russia's invasion, which is a very current topic. And so we will, after that, open to discussion. So hopefully you will enjoy the panel. And whenever you want, Cristina, the time is yours.
Thank you very much, Lucinda. It's a pleasure for me to be here. And it's also a pleasure to have the Universidad de Barcelona collaborating in this program. This is the third edition of Defensa y Yo, a program organized, as you said, by the US Embassy in Spain and esglobal, with the aim of fostering the culture of defense among Spanish university students. You all study something that is related to international affairs, but most times don't have the opportunity to understand, to see, and go a little bit deep into security and defense matters. And those matters are critical for our life as citizens, and mostly as citizens of democratic society. So that's the scope. Just let me tell you a couple of things about the dynamic of this session. Both Kevin and Sonia will speak shortly. They will present their ideas, then I'll make them some questions, and then I'll invite you to also make questions. Please raise your hands whenever you want. We want to have a lively conversation with you. And also, as a reminder, in case I forget at the end of the session, you know, this program has two parts. One is these debates. You will be able to watch it online on esglobal afterwards. You can also watch and be aware of the rest of the debates with the other universities throughout Spain. But the other part of the program is a competition in which you are all invited to participate, to present your ideas, papers, videos, podcasts, whatever you want, on the topic we've covered today. And the nice thing is that there is a winner per university, so you have many chances to win. And the prize is a visit to Brussels to visit NATO's headquarters, so you'll be able to see Kevin there in October, and also to visit other people and institutions related to security matters. So it's a really nice experience for all those who have already gone. So without further delay, let me give the floor to Kevin. Sorry. Are you starting? Yes. Oh, sorry, to Sonia.
Thank you very much. Good morning. First time speaking in this room, actually, even if I'm a teacher here. I've never been in NATO headquarters, so maybe I should also make the competition, because I think it would be really interesting. It's a pleasure to be with esglobal again. You should check the website, because it's one of the best think tanks that we have in Spain for international and global affairs. I always tell my students they have lots of free access documents and analysis, and they are always making, events and things to disseminate what they do. So if you don't know the website, just check them. That said, we decided that it would be me not speaking first, because Kevin works at NATO currently, but he's really an expert on the Ukraine relation, which I'm not. And considering that you're law students, we thought I could start first by explaining you what is defense, what is collective defense, and what is NATO history in terms of the relation with international systems, so that you know how we got here. And then we will listen to Kevin, understanding what is happening now and the impact that it has. So if I ask you what is the difference between security and defense, what would you say? If I say, do you feel secure here now, in this room? Yes, most people. Do you feel defended? Then what's the difference? Alex? Military, for people who are listening, because they are recording the session, Alex said, for me, defense has to do more with the military. Those two concepts have been evolving and changing, okay? We take the international system, the system that we have now with all its ups and downs, from 1945. 1945 is the end of World War II, but it's also the beginning of most of the instruments and the pillars that we have now in this system. One of those instruments is international security. International security was the concept that winners of World War II decided that was the main goal to start building from in 1945. Because it was, although we have World War I was much more focused geographically. World War II showed countries around the world that even if you did not want to take part in it, you could end up being affected by that war. Because for the first time, armament, transports, communications, many things allowed wars to cover regions around the world that had not actually taken active part into the war. So in 1945, those countries that decide to create the new United Nations instead of the dying League of Nations, they said we need to care for international security. Until that moment, the concept that states had was national security. I care about what happens inside my borders. And either I am at peace or I am at war. Peace was seen just as what happens between war and war, not something to be protected, something to be worked for. So in that moment, this shift changes absolutely the way states are going to work for the system. Even those countries that wanted to be more isolationist or did not want to take really strong action, they knew they could be affected by things that would happen around the world. So the UN is funded with this main goal of peaceful resolution for conflicts with final goal of international security. International security for states, not for people yet in 1945, right? So in that moment, when they start working for security, is all those things that are not, Alex was saying, defense, military. In that moment, this has changed also. Security in that moment was to provide things that make people live without a fear, right? So that people could live in those countries thinking, I'm not going to suffer a war, but also I'm not going to suffer from hunger, I'm not going to suffer from poorness, I'm going to have basic things secured. By whom? By the state or by whoever can provide it. International security, therefore, in that moment, it meant for the countries that we're going to try to avoid wars around the world. And therefore, we're going to use the other mechanisms: economy, politics, ideology, culture, any other public sphere that we can use, diplomacy for sure, to avoid wars between countries. Okay, but then this was very nice, right, on the paper, super ideal. We've just finished a terrible war that has left Europe devastated and many other areas in the world. Reality came, which was those winners that had agreed on how to finish the war did not see what next the same way. And the US, and in that moment the USSR, had very different views of how this had to be posed. Yes, we all want peace and we all want international security, but how do we want it? It's different. Cold War starts, and in just 2 years after the war, 1947, both systems, both poles of power are creating internal systems in each bloc. So instead of being a whole international system, the two powers are going to start designing one system and one subsystem. The system led by the US in that moment is going to decide or design some mechanisms, and the system led by the USSR is going to design and impose different mechanisms. Both powers were thinking about military mechanisms, political mechanisms, and economic mechanisms. Why? Because they had seen those were the things that allowed them to finish with World War II and with the axis of Nazism and fascism, right? On this side, the Western side, my side, this side, West side, okay? The military option is going to be NATO. Why? Because the US has been fighting in Europe to finish Nazis, but also together with some European armies, together with French army, together with the British army, and this has allowed the West bloc of the war to advance through Normandy and through different places to get to Berlin and defeat Nazis, right? East bloc, the USSR, the Red Army has been advancing through the East. Okay, they both realize having an army is important, but Europe is devastated and someone will take Europe. So better let's do it us than the other. That's what they both think. This instrument that is going to be imposed or pushed from the US together with the European countries that want to join is going to have a new goal, that is collective defense. It's not collective security, which was the UN, but it's collective defense. We're going to be pushing for security from the UN, development, economy, agriculture, health, all those instruments we're going to be slowly working on from the UN. But the West countries believe they still have to protect, because now they have a new enemy, which is the USSR and the East Bloc. And therefore we need to be ready for any war. To be ready, it means to work proactively. So security is something you work on a long term to keep improving and increasing your level of security. But defense is something you need to work so that you can be ready. If I ask you, what is defense? Alex said, military, yes, but in normal days, if you go through the street, security means that you walk and you know that Barcelona City Town Hall has assured that pavement will not break down, right? And that street lamps will not fall on you, and that the air will not kill you from pollution. Let's hope, right? Defense would be you walk through Barcelona streets and someone attacks you. What are you going to do? This or this, right? This is defense. And you need to be ready, because if a strong man comes to me and I have nothing, I will not be able to defend myself. I have no technique, I have no instruments, I don't know what the other person wants from me, what is the intention. My possibilities of succeeding with my attack are really tiny. If I've done martial arts, if I have a knife, if I know who my enemy is, what are the intentions, I might have a little success, little possibility. That is defense. So we started working on security all together at the UN, but defense was going to be different. And that's the first main goal of NATO. Now, NATO then is created together as a North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So with North Atlantic, we were creating a new geopolitical region somehow. A region that has one concept of being one defense region, one unique region in terms of defense. And the most known thing is Article 5, right? If you attack one, you attack all of us. It's like creating a band of friends and saying, if you deal with my friend, you're dealing with all of us. Because we will react together to this attack. We will defend all of us together. So it's collective because we're going to put different resources. We're different friends. One is tall, one is short, one has money, the other doesn't. But we're going to put together everything we can to contribute so that we can react together to those threats and become one unique region in terms of defense. Should I? Yes, so I'll just finish and pass the word and the floor to Kevin. So this is how, Did I tell something? Sorry. Were you telling me that it's too long that I'm talking? So this is how we got to the 1990s. 1990s, NATO had the first difficult tests because we had the Balkan Wars, we had Rwanda genocide. Later on in the 2000s, we had wars in Middle East, and then more lately we had cases that have been severely criticized by many people around the world, like Libya, right? So we've had different tests where the conjuncture or the system has said, okay, the UN is incapable or unwilling to do something here. Who will do it? And in some of them, NATO has said, okay, we'll do it. But then first times are not always successful. So there's been ups and downs, and there's been some main peaks, but also some historical successes from NATO forces. In any case, that's how we get to 2000s, 2020, right? Where things have changed a lot. So from 1945, this bipolar system that we were saying, that is mainly focused on security and working a little bit on defense. We had all the arms race during Cold War, September 11, defense becomes a thing all these decades. And we get to 2020 or 2022 now, right? With a very blurred borders on what is security and what is defense. Many academics, for example, believe that NATO is also doing a lot of security now. And probably the UN is seeing if peace missions can make some defense, because otherwise they are very low of resources, or they have a very, very limited margin of reaction. So these blurred borders of what is security, what is defense, allow the debate that we're having now. That is welcoming new countries into NATO a security investment, because we are expanding our security zone, our comfort zone? Is it more a defense movement because we are reacting against a potential enemy or what we believe to be a threat and a risk? Where is the red line there? And I think for this first intervention, I'll leave it here and I'll pass you the floor, Kevin.
Yeah, just let me add, Sonia, thank you very much for framing the historical context and how we've reached here. As you were speaking, when we were defining this program from the very beginning, we took into account that security for many years has gone beyond what we usually understood by security. After the crisis in 2008, we started to speak about economic security. I mean, that is not part of NATO's mandate, but it is part of our concept of security. With the pandemic, we've all known that there is a health security that we have to take care of. We are very, very much aware of cybersecurity now. I'm not saying that we take all the precautions that we need, but cybersecurity is part of our lives because we all have these, and we can be surveilled, attacked at any minute. So that's why I said at the very beginning that as citizens in democratic societies, we need to be aware of what security is and how it concerns us beyond the military aspect. So having said that,
and actually, some would say that what is at stake in Ukraine, Russia scenarios has to do also with political security, democratic security, and allowing interferences in other countries or not, and right. So,
Kevin, thank you. The floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much. It's a really great theoretical overview and a good point to jump into NATO's partnership with Ukraine. Just to introduce myself very quickly. I'm Kevin Daucher. I'm a Foreign Service Officer. I work for the United States State Department. Currently, I'm assigned to the U.S. mission to NATO. So I don't work for NATO, the organization. I work for basically what is the U.S. embassy to the NATO organization. And while I'm there, mostly what I work on right now is Ukraine. I also cover Georgia and Moldova and a couple other sort of policy matters. I completely agree with with everything you said, but the last point that you made about the sort of the political security element of what is going on in Ukraine. And one of the sort of major reasons compelling us, the NATO alliance and sort of nations of the West in general, to support Ukraine is not just to help Ukraine defend itself from an illegal invasion by Russia, but it's also to prevent this from becoming a precedent, right? We can't allow Russia to do this to Ukraine, because then we are implicitly allowing Russia to do it to other countries as well. We're saying that is now a thing that we have accepted, or at least we won't interfere in if we don't do anything in Ukraine. So not setting the precedent, or not allowing a precedent to be set, is a very big deal. Before I get into my presentation, I want to just go over a couple vocabulary things. First, working at NATO and working in the defense realm in general means, well, working at NATO means I talk very fast, because usually we're limited to 3 minutes. If I talk too fast for anybody, please raise your hand and I'll slow down. I think I succeeded last time, but you never know. Second, working in defense means I use a lot of abbreviations and acronyms and words that have a certain meaning in normal people's English, but have a much different meaning in like NATO English. So if I use any abbreviations that I don't explain, or words that seem to mean something different to me than it does to like regular human beings, again, please let me know and I will slow down and explain myself. A couple of those words that I want to start off with. I will use the word allies and I will use the word NATO to mean different things. When I say allies, I'm really talking about the individual countries and their sort of sovereign actions. Also, when I say allies, I'm saying it with a capital A to mean just the 30 NATO allies. For instance, the United States is also an ally, small a, with Australia, but we are an ally, capital A, with Spain or the UK or France. So when I say allies, I mean individual countries. When I say NATO, I mean the organization. Or when I say the alliance, I usually mean the organization and not the individual countries. Then also the difference between allies and partners is an important one at NATO and less important when normal human beings talk about these things. Allies in a NATO context means just those 30 allies, maybe soon 32, who benefit from this Article 5 cooperative defense guarantee that we have, or collective defense guarantee that we have. Partners is a broader group of countries. NATO has right now 38 partners that are not NATO allies, with whom we do some activities, but who do not benefit from this Article 5 guarantee. Okay, so everybody clear on allies versus partners, allies versus NATO. Great. All right. So I'd like to do a really quick history lesson about about Ukraine's partnership with NATO. Ukraine was, well, right after the breakup of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, NATO established a new program to really dramatically increase the number of partnerships that it had in order to sort of address this issue of there being many new nations in the world, and how do we sort of approach these nations and make sure that we have some kind of relationship, that NATO has some kind of political relationship with these countries, so that we can avoid having the kind of void in security policy that maybe we saw after World War II, which created these stark lines between the West and NATO and the Soviet Union. So we were trying to branch out and reach out to these countries of the former Soviet Union. Ukraine was the first of those countries, other than Russia, to be brought into what we call the Partnership for Peace. That was 1994. Fairly soon after that, in 1997, we established with Ukraine a sort of increased partnership, recognizing that Ukraine was, one, a very large country and a relatively powerful country in terms of sort of relative to many of the other post-Soviet states, and also one that had some concerns with its Russian neighbor, and in addition had a stockpile of nuclear weapons that they needed a lot of advice on how to handle these things. So in 1997, we established what we call the distinctive partnership with Ukraine, and part of that partnership, we established at NATO the NATO-Ukraine Commission. We had previously established the NATO-Russia Council. The NATO-Russia Council was an alliance plus Russia body where these countries, so all of the countries of the NATO alliance, could sit down with Russia and make joint decisions in sort of the same consensus model that NATO decisions are made. I want to take a step back because I forget that I have not really explained how NATO works. NATO takes all decisions by consensus. There are no votes at NATO. Everything is agreed by 100% of the allies, or it is not agreed at all. So when you see declarations or statements coming out of NATO, the organization, or if you see policies coming out of NATO, the organization, it means all 30 allies have agreed on every single word and in fact, every single comma and period that is written down in those things. I know that because it is my job to sit there and literally argue about the commas. I had a story about a comma that was in the wrong place and it caused some big problems. It was because somebody like me didn't negotiate that piece of paper. So anyway, NATO works by consensus. We established the NATO-Russia Council so that we could make consensus decisions with Russia. Now, obviously, there are not a lot of issues that we can talk about with Russia. There are not a lot of things that we agree on sort of a consensus basis with Russia, but we recognized that it was important to have that kind of relationship with Russia so that when we found issues where we had to have serious discussions and issues where there were sort of mutual interests, we could make consensus decisions. Because we established that relationship with Russia, we then established a similar, if not exactly the same relationship with Ukraine to, again, have a forum where we could make consensus decisions. Much of the motivation behind that was because Ukraine at the time was still in possession of a substantial supply of nuclear weapons and nuclear material left over from the Soviet Union. But there were also other security and defense concerns that Ukraine had that they sought the advice, not just of Russia, but also from the West. Moving much later on, that relationship built fairly slowly, but in 2008, we saw Russia taking a much more aggressive stance towards some of its neighbors and start building up forces along the borders with some of its neighbors. In this case, especially Ukraine and Georgia in particular in 2008. Before the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008, but while this large buildup of forces along the border was going along, NATO held a summit, not because of the buildup, but because it's sort of an almost annual thing that we do. We held a summit, a meeting of all of the NATO leaders in Bucharest. And one of the outcomes of the Bucharest summit is what you will see in the news now referred to often as the Bucharest decisions. This is a big topic that comes up when we're talking about Ukraine and Ukraine's relationship with NATO. Essentially what the Bucharest decisions were when we're talking about Ukraine and talking about Georgia as well, was the NATO leaders at this summit agreed to a statement, which means they negotiated every single word of it, that said Ukraine and Georgia will become NATO members. Now, that was, I can't speak to exactly why it was phrased exactly that way or what exactly how the negotiations went in the room. But I think it was sort of a signal that was hopefully meant to dissuade Russia from what seemed to be their intent to invade Georgia. Obviously, it did not work. But importantly, what this statement did not say, it said Georgia and Ukraine will become NATO members. But it did not say, and when you're reading these statements and reading sort of these consensus documents, it is important to read not just what the things say, but what they don't say, because often that is also very, very revealing. And it says something about how the conversation went behind the closed doors. It did not say when they would become members, and it did not offer them sort of a checklist for if you accomplish all of these things, you will become members. So we agreed in 2008 that both of these countries would become members, and yet today, in 2022, they still are not. This is obviously a thing that causes a lot of frustration among both Ukrainians and Georgians, and you will often hear their leaders say, and I think maybe correctly, that had both of these had full membership and the security, or I keep on, the defense guarantee offered by Article 5, that perhaps Russia would not have invaded either of those countries. It's a theoretical argument. It's hypothetical, so I don't know that it's true. But this is the argument that both Georgia and Ukraine offer, and it's never, and it is still to this day a source of great frustration. Under the Washington Treaty, which is where we get Article 5 and the security guarantee, we also have Article 10. This is the sort of how a nation becomes a member of NATO. We refer to the open door policy, which is to say that NATO is not a recruiting organization. We're not evangelical. We don't seek out new members, but we say the door is open, and if new members want to come in, they are free to come in, provided they meet 3 qualifications. One, they have to be a European country. The United States and Canada got in before we actually agreed to this, so it essentially means Mexico probably could never become a NATO member. So they have to be a European country. They have to be able to contribute to the collective defense of the alliance, and they have to uphold the sort of democratic standards that the other members of the alliance uphold. And assuming you meet all 3 of those criteria, then you're welcome to join. When we made this guarantee, or when we made this promise in 2008 to Ukraine and to Georgia, it was essentially agreed by all allies that neither country could at that time meet those 2 last requirements. They're both European countries, but maybe we're not in a position at the time to effectively contribute on sort of a net basis to the collective security and fully uphold the Western standards. So we established the annual national programs, sort of plans for every year what these 2 countries are going to do to progress towards NATO standards of military operations, organizational standards, and also meet some of these democratic standards. And since 2008, we've established what are the 2 most substantial relationships that NATO has with any 2 partners. The partnership with Ukraine and the partnership with Georgia are probably the 2 biggest partnerships that we have, because we have enormous programs of assistance to move them towards meeting these standards that we expect of all allies. We've also made both of these countries what we call enhanced opportunities partners, which is sort of the like the platinum tier level of NATO partnership. There are only 6 countries that have this enhanced opportunities partnership status: Finland and Sweden, who are meet sort of all of the Western standards and have up until very recently sort of voluntarily chosen not to become NATO members, but it was sort of assumed that anytime they wanted to, they could join, because they are fully militarily interoperable with Western standards. So Finland, Sweden, Georgia, Ukraine, Jordan, and Australia, I think, are the last 2. These are the 6 enhanced opportunities partners. So we have these really substantial relationships with both Georgia and Ukraine. As part of that partnership, Ukraine has contributed to NATO operations around the world. They contributed in Afghanistan, I think in Iraq, in Kosovo. They also participate in NATO exercises fairly frequently. And we, sort of in 2016, I think it was, brought all of this assistance that we do, all of these individual assistance programs that we had with Ukraine, which included things like, in addition to, well, the main thing was bringing Ukraine up to NATO military standards, moving them away from a Soviet model of military organization to a Western model of military organization. One of the key parts of that was establishing in the Ukrainian military a corps of non-commissioned officers. These are like the sergeants who run small units. The difference between that and the Soviet model is that these non-commissioned officers have a lot of autonomy, able to sort of take broad strategic orders and then go forth and execute a plan as they see fit, as long as they're moving towards this objective. Whereas the Soviet model, typically, even individual units have to ask all the way up to their generals, okay, can I move a kilometer down this road? Okay, can I move another kilometer down this road? And they move more slowly. And one benefit that we've seen even very recently in this war that Russia is waging against Ukraine is Ukrainians have benefited from this move to this Western model. Their forces are much more nimble than the Russian forces who still operate on this old Soviet model and are able to adapt much more quickly than the Russian forces are to changing circumstances. Anyway, so it included this sort of shift to the NATO model of military doing things, but also things like, some of these are very boring, but like counter IED training, explosive ordnance disposal, and lots of little programs. In 2016, we brought all of those programs under what is now called the Comprehensive Assistance Package. And I'm sorry for all of these terms, but this is how government people talk. So we have the Comprehensive Assistance Package, which had this huge range of assistance programs. Sure. Let me just get to what is going on right now, and then which is in about 2 minutes, and then I'll come to you. We had this huge range of assistance to Ukraine through NATO, and then Russia invaded Ukraine. At that point, almost all NATO assistance had to stop immediately. This was for two reasons. One, we had NATO trainers on the ground helping them with these capacity programs, and we couldn't have NATO people in danger of the Russian shelling. In addition, there was a very conscious decision made at the very beginning of this conflict to ensure that not only is NATO not going to be party to the conflict, but we're not going to allow it to even look like NATO is party to the conflict, and not give Russia sort of the pretext to point and say, no, look, there are NATO people on the ground in Ukraine, and so we, Russia, are fighting NATO. We're not fighting Ukraine. This is their story. So we very quickly pulled out, and our assistance package since then, has been very, very limited, or at least NATO assistance to Ukraine has been very, very limited. NATO, since the beginning of the war, has provided only non-lethal military assistance to Ukraine, and delivering that assistance not even into Ukraine. We drop it off sort of along NATO's borders with Ukraine, in Poland or in Romania or in other places that are close to the border, and the Ukrainians come over, pick it up. Non-lethal military assistance, what does that mean? It is things like first aid kits, tents, heaters, fuel, things like that. Nothing that explodes, nothing that can kill another human being. And we're, again, very, very careful about NATO as an organization not providing any of that to prevent Russia from using this as a pretext. And here's where I get to my original point about the difference between NATO and allies. Because allies, as everybody here knows, are providing an enormous amount of lethal military assistance to Ukraine. This is mostly through the coordination of the United States, through a different body that we call the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, the UDCG. And that is not just NATO allies, but it's actually something like 50 plus countries around the world. So including partners like Australia and Japan, some partners in the Middle East, I think even maybe some partners in South America, all donating equipment that Ukraine needs to prosecute the war. So when you think about the assistance that is going to Ukraine, there's a very, very clear distinction between the sort of very minimal role that NATO has providing just non-lethal assistance and the enormous role that allies and then other countries beyond the NATO alliance are providing to Ukraine. The lethal assistance, the artillery, and the weapons that NATO needs, or sorry, that Ukraine needs to prosecute the war. I think I can leave it at that right now, just to sort of lay out exactly who is doing what. I'm happy to take a question unless we want to do that, but I saw your hand. So.
I think it's much better to listen to them.
Wait.
Just wait 1 second for the microphone.
My question was like if the idea of the statements of 2008 was to prevent the invasions of Georgia and Ukraine.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't NATO accept Ukraine as a member now? Because if we understand that when Russia invades Ukraine, then they can invade another countries. For example, Eastern European countries, or I don't know, another countries.
Yeah.
So if they don't accept now Ukraine as a member, maybe it will be never because they will not recover.
Yeah. So first off, I should clarify about the 2008 decisions. I think I said, I don't honestly know exactly why they arrived at exactly the phrasing that they arrived at. This is my guess that it was an attempt to convince Russia not to do it. But I don't know. This is not the statement of the U.S. government or NATO. This is really just my personal guess how they arrived at that language. But getting back to what I also said about how you read NATO statements or how you read these consensus statements, you also have to read what is not there. And the opportunity to have said, we now admit Ukraine and Georgia to the alliance today, they could have written that and they chose not to. And I think that shows you that there was not a consensus available. The alliance, at least one country must have been sitting in that room saying, I don't think these two countries are ready yet to become members. And at the time it was, I think very clearly, because we have since 2008 had this enormous assistance program, been that they at the time did not meet a lot of the NATO standards. They did not measure up to the sort of military interoperability and could not convince all 30, or well, it wasn't 30 at that time, but could not convince all allies at the time that they could make this contribution to Allied security and could uphold the values. The fact that they are still not allies, I think, says that we continue to have the same issue, that there is no consensus among the allies on membership. In terms of why it hasn't happened during the conflict, though, I will say that is because we have focused our efforts entirely on making sure Ukraine wins the war. And when I say we, I mean allies individually and through the organization. NATO can't offer the lethal military assistance, but our entire effort is focused now on making sure Ukraine comes out of this having both won the war and not sort of succumbed to Russian demands. Because if Ukraine loses the war, then questions about membership don't matter anymore, right? Russia's stated goal has been is to see the sort of destruction of Ukraine. If that happens, then questions of membership are no longer relevant. So since February, our primary objective has been making sure Ukraine wins the war, and questions about Ukraine's membership in NATO are going to happen after Ukraine's victory.
Is there any other question that you want to make now? Please.
So I can see what you said about not providing lethal help through NATO, but I was wondering if NATO is providing strategic military help or intelligence help through NATO, or even if not through NATO, but like the loophole of going through the states to help Ukraine in this matter?
So I wouldn't call it a loophole. NATO again is being very, very careful about not providing any lethal military assistance, and I mean, like in these terms, even things like intelligence, directing attacks would be considered becoming, or could plausibly be argued as NATO becoming party to the conflict. So NATO, the organization, is absolutely not providing any intelligence direction, is not providing any strategic guidance. Allies, through the United States in particular, but many other allies in particular, but many other allies, and Ukraine's other partners who are not NATO allies, are absolutely contributing these kinds of things. I wouldn't call it, it's not a loophole, because this is not a conflict between Russia and NATO. This is a conflict between, well, it is Russia's war on Ukraine and a really enormous across the world has come together to support Ukraine. You know, the fact that Australia is contributing things, Japan, I mean, like, you know, countries really all over the place. I think demonstrates that it really is not just a NATO thing, and it is that they are convinced that Ukraine needs to succeed in this war, both because it is the right thing, because Russia is waging this war illegally, but also because of this precedent that I talked about at the beginning, and countries around the world that sort of thrive through the international order that was established after World War II, and the rules that govern that order, see Russia's invasion as an attempt to not just conquer territory that they want, but also to subvert these rules that we have succeeded based upon, that Russia doesn't like anymore.
Sonia.
Yes.
So your answer is NATO is not doing it.
Because I'm not here on behalf of the government, I'm going to add a little bit like Edel's advocate, but I'm always telling in class to students that teaching international politics, it's quite frustrating because it has lots of hypocrisies, right? So adding to both questions and to what Kevin answered, I think it's finding that balance between we want you officially to be known as potential allies, but not really getting into the conflict directly, because it would mean an escalation of tension and war for the whole world, right? So your question, I think the first one, including a country that is now at war into an organization, it means that you are accepting that the war affects the whole organization. So it's the most dangerous time to welcome a new country. It would be a huge political movement for sure, but it would mean that directly the whole organization would have to answer to that war. And this would just bring an escalation of conflict for everyone, right? But then going to Elisa's question, is this, I don't know if hypocrisy is the word, but like there's always different ways of doing things. So officially the organization cannot do it because it would mean it's taking part in the war, but then countries can provide help in many different ways. So it's always finding the way of getting there, right? In a legal way that does not imply higher consequences. I don't know if I've been enough politically correct, but like there's always a way. And also for international law, I think you're all students of law with Elisenda, and you know that international law is there, but what we were saying now is if Russia does an invasion, it's different than if another country does an invasion, because we've had examples. And it would set a precedent. It would set a precedent because it's Russia, because we know about other countries in the world that have stepped on other countries' sovereignty or other countries' territory, and the consequences have been very different. Those are the things we have to deal with the international system. You can agree or not, but it's how it goes. And we just try to be as coherent as possible, probably.
So just the escalation issue is incredibly important. It's one of it is probably the main reason why we are being very careful that NATO does not become or does not even look like it's part of the conflict. It's also why no allies and none of Ukraine's partners are sending their own forces into Ukraine to participate in the war. This is Russia's war against Ukraine, and while these 50 plus countries have all decided to provide assistance to Ukraine so that Ukraine can defend itself, no other country is defending Ukraine. And a large part of that is because the moment that, especially if it were a NATO ally, were to send troops into Ukraine, all of a sudden it escalates the war. All of a sudden it makes this a war between not just Russia and Ukraine, but Russia and the alliance, or Russia and Ukraine plus however many other countries. So avoiding escalation is a hugely important consideration, particularly because NATO is a nuclear organization, and an actual conflict between two nuclear powers as opposed to Russia invading Ukraine, not a nuclear power, would be an enormous step.
Any other question? Please.
Hello, my question is for Kevin. So Euro-Atlantic integration has been one of the main goals of Georgia and Ukraine since their independence. And first of all, I would like to ask you, what chances do Ukraine and Georgia really have to be members of NATO and the European Union, and what degree of influence has Russia's foreign policy on Georgia and Ukraine with regard to their memberships of the EU and NATO? Thank you. I
can't really speak to the EU question as one of the few people in here who is not a citizen of an EU country. I don't really get to comment on it, so I can't speak to the odds there. As to the chances of Ukraine and Georgia becoming NATO members, it's 100%. The question is the timeline. We have agreed that they will become members. That is policy. It is agreed policy. That is not changing. We are committed to their membership. The question is, when do they sort of meet the criteria?
Thank you.
Yes, your question was for Kevin, but Cristina says maybe as a European I can answer a little bit. I'm not an expert on European Union, so I don't want to take that for granted. But I would say for the last decade, at least, with the last big extension, yes, of the European Union, things about including new members are a bit like on a standstill or standby, because like the last extension was lots of countries at the same time, and it has proved to bring some difficulties with it at the European Parliament, but also at the Commission and in other senses. That said, with all these international organizations, I think there has to be a new rethought and rebalance of what was the main purpose, and if that purpose is the same one right now. Because both NATO or the European Union, as we have said, have been built upon some pillars that might have changed a little bit now. So if the European Union is supposed to be an organization in positive, but about Europeans, setting the borders is a huge issue, because you're saying up to where the European Union gets, and we couldn't do it with Turkey, which has been an enhanced potential new member for I don't know how many decades. We haven't done it with some of the Balkan countries, and we haven't done it with Caucasus yet. And those regions would mean the European borders make it to the Russian Federation, or make it to Iran, or make it to... So setting that border is one of the difficulties. When it comes to NATO, it's more or less, for me, the same analysis, but in a different way, because you're setting your defense border. And what we said before is probably Georgia, considering Georgia's cultural, political background, but also the Ossetia territories there, and the geostrategical relevance that the whole Caucasus, the three Caucasus countries have. Probably it was more direct way of saying like, oh, we need to do something because Russia cannot invade Georgia. But I'm not sure, again, if it was so clear for NATO members to say, and we really need Georgia inside NATO. So I think it's between those debates always for both organizations, whether we want those areas to be allies, special allies, enhanced allies, or we actually want them to be members, because that would move our borders of the organizations and then our responsibilities and our duties. And I'm not sure one organization, the European Union, is willing to do that because of internal crisis, and the other one because of strategic priorities. I don't know.
If I may add to that, because I work very much in the European Union, if you remember, the Maidan events took place because Russia impeded at the last minute that Ukraine signed a new association agreement with the European Union. After all that happened, the European Union signed that association agreement. Since then, the European Union has invested something like 15,000 million euros in aid to Ukraine for them to democratize and to improve their institutions and so on, because that is one of the main obstacles for Ukraine to become a member. And it's, as it has been said, there are many issues behind. We all know the problems with Poland and Hungary right now, with Bulgaria and with Romania because of different things. So there is a lot of reluctance there. In my view, there is a political issue behind. If after the war, once the war is over, once Ukraine has been accepted as a potential member, if the European Union doesn't show its commitment to Ukraine becoming a member, then it really has a problem. It has had a problem with Turkey. Frustration, Kevin, you said that with regards to NATO. You cannot support a country which is fighting for the values that you say you support, and then not giving them the means to become a member. That's my personal view, and there is a division in Brussels and the capitals around this, but it's a long-term issue and very crucial issue. There was another question there.
If we agree that the Ukraine and the Russia war, let's say, it doesn't really affect the NATO members, so they can't directly do anything about it, then why all the countries are like doing their best for Ukraine to win? And for example, in the situations like Israel and Palestine, Azerbaijan and Armenia, nothing is done. Like it does affect NATO and Europe.
Well, so I disagree with your premise. From the very beginning, we agreed that Russia's invasion of Ukraine affected us a great deal, which is why countries have contributed to helping Ukraine win the war. Again, to prevent setting this precedent. What we are trying to make very clear is that while the implications of Russia being able to wage this war, or God forbid Russia winning this war, would affect all of the countries in Europe and the NATO alliance, we want to make very clear that NATO is not part of the fight, in the same way that the United States is not actually fighting there. It will affect us, sure, but that doesn't mean that we are party to the conflict. So the distinction that I'm trying to make here is not that NATO doesn't see this affecting them. This war is the most consequential thing for the NATO alliance right now. All we're trying to make very clear is that we're not doing the fighting at NATO. We are helping Ukraine defend itself from the attack.
And I think it goes back to what Kevin explained to all of you at the beginning, the difference between the countries that are part of NATO and NATO as an organization. So those countries feel that this war could affect them, and therefore they are helping in a bilateral or multilateral, but like nationally contributing. But if the attack is on the organization, what we said, the escalation and the consequences are much higher. You can take, for example, examples like in Mali or in even in Libya, in other places where some countries agreed there needs to be done, something needs to be done, but we're not going to do it with the umbrella of NATO or the UN, so we're going to do it asking who wants to help. And in Mali, it was a military mission commanded from France, but with contributions from other countries, but it was not officially a European Union defense mission. So it's different when the missions go in the umbrella of the organization or if help comes from the countries. It's a matter of also international law. You're activating or not those mechanisms. Is it more clear now?
Yes, but for example, those countries, do they send just weapons or also soldiers?
No soldiers right now deployed from NATO.
Russia is like the biggest country in the world. With the amount of the soldiers they have, with just weapons, how is Ukraine gonna defend themselves?
Well, first off, they have actually been defending themselves. It is a terrible war that is going on, and I don't want to minimize that at all. I mean, it is absolutely horrible to watch. As the guy who has to, I'm U.S. mission who has to talk to my Ukrainian counterparts. I meet with them every day, and having to discuss what's going on in their country. Like I can't imagine what they're feeling when their families are still there. Their sons are. I thought so. It is an enormous tragedy. The consequence, though, of allies sending their troops into this war that they're not involved at now, or they're not party to now, is this escalation, and that is what I think everybody is trying to avoid. The transformation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, horrible as it is, with war crimes that they are committing every day, to a war that is not just Russia invading Ukraine, but Russia fighting a war against a nuclear-powered NATO alliance. And the consequence of that is as horrible as the war in Ukraine is right now, unimaginable. That's the kind of thing that we are trying to avoid by avoiding the escalation. Ensuring Ukraine wins the war, as difficult as it is our chief concern. But avoiding this major escalation is another concern that we have to consider.
You had another question there? And then maybe we can move to another part of the room for questions.
So I can understand how letting right now Ukraine into the NATO is out of the question and why. But you could argue that this war has been coming since 2014. And what I was wondering if the adherence of those regions into Russia also made it impossible for Ukraine to get into NATO then, or had it been possible then and it hasn't been done?
Well, first I would say that because we said in 2008 Ukraine will become a member of NATO, the fact that it did not become a member of NATO in, say, 2013 before Russia invaded Crimea says that they had not yet met all the criteria. So it wasn't Russia's invasion of Ukraine that prevented Ukraine from becoming a NATO member. It was allies had not yet formed a consensus that Ukraine met all of the criteria to become a NATO member. I think that is probably still the case, and it is not really a question of Russia having invaded Crimea or not. It's like I won't sit here and say that that's not a very significant complication, but the underlying fact is if they were not ready to become a member, or the allies had not reached a consensus that Ukraine was ready to become a member on February 23rd, the day before Russia, completed its further invasion of, or started its further invasion of Ukraine. They're not significantly closer to meeting the criteria today than they were on February 23rd.
Anyone else?
So do you think that if Ukraine wins the war, they will have chances to become part of the NATO partnership, or
NATO member, NATO
NATO
ally,
member?
partnership
NATO
versus ally. Again, as I said, like 100% chance. We have already said they will become a NATO ally. I don't know what the timeline is going to be, but I will say that if they had not met the criteria the day before the war started, I don't think it's likely that when they win the war, they will all of a sudden be determined, or we will all of a sudden have consensus that now they do meet these criteria. The war itself will not change, should not change the Allied consensus on the criteria that is necessary for Ukraine to become a member. I don't like to make guesses. Is what it comes down to. I don't want to make predictions. We have already said that they will. It's just a matter of when.
Any other question? So let me make you the same question, two questions to both of you, because the other part of this equation, of course, is Russia. And talking about commas, there is this story about how there is a misunderstanding, or at least that is maybe the excuse that the Russian leaders give for believing that right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when all these discussions were taking place, when Ukraine was dismantling its nuclear power because of all these conversations, the US president told Gorbachev at the time that NATO borders could move to former Warsaw Pact, Warsaw Treaty countries. And therefore, now Russia, now for the last decades, especially Putin, feels betrayed because they believe, I don't know whether that is the excuse, but that is an excuse that they use, that they always believe that NATO wouldn't go beyond its former borders. So my two questions are, what sort of security architecture do you foresee for Europe and the world after the war? How can we deal with Russia in that regard? You can consider both scenarios, that Ukraine wins and how wins and so on, but what kind of security architecture we may have after the war? And that links to my second question, which is what kind of international order we can have. Because, Sonia, you were describing at the beginning how the international security concept was born within that new organization that the UN was, and how ineffective for this purpose is now. And it has the original sin of the veto power. Russia has, and China has blocked anything within the Security Council that has to do with this conflict and with other conflicts. But we know that the Security Council is not working because of the veto power, and it's just a vicious circle. Can the organization renew itself? Can it be the basis for a new international order? Not just after the war, but for this new world that we are seeing. I know they are very easy questions and we have 5 minutes, but just to give an overview.
I think you've made like 20 questions in that intervention.
Very simple. What is the
And
global
I
security?
know.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm going to disagree in one point. I think the UN is not proving ineffective for global security in the wide term of security that we defend nowadays. I think the UN, with all the critiques that we can make, brings security in many areas, in many places in the world. UN Women, human rights, water security, food security, right? It's just not proving successful for traditional security, which is more has to do with wars, because there's always a veto, and then veto is politicized, so it's absolutely different when it's like a crisis in Venezuela, and then we all agree it's a humanitarian crisis, and therefore it would even be justified to intervene. But when people are dying from hunger in another place, maybe it's not a humanitarian crisis. So veto power biases everything. That is, it's clear. With Ukraine and what you were asking about the Warsaw Pact, so remember when at the beginning I told you one bloc opted for NATO, the other one opted for the Warsaw Pact. And the Warsaw Pact was not really a big thing, strong thing for too long, but it was a mental image of what were those borders of defense realities, right? And I can understand from the Russian perspective, knowing a little bit of how anthropologically the Russian society is and what they actually respect and what they appreciate in their leaders. I can understand that the European Union, or what they understand to be Western values, advancing feels like a threat.
Mm-hmm.
Because history is there, but also real politics. And I can see all Russian leaders saying this Westernization of countries that used to be part of the USSR, or used to be part of what Russia feels is their area of influence, becoming more pro-Western. That is clearly a threat. And that is like in realpolitik, we can understand that. If the answer to that is including those countries into NATO or not, I'm not so sure. I don't have an opinion on that, to be honest, because I think Russia a decade ago or a decade and a half ago was different model. I might agree or not, but it was like legitimate model, right? But the last years, it's really going into una deriva. I really don't know how to say it, but like a turmoil because of more illiberate democracy elements and getting more and more like, uncontrolled and unpredictable. So it's difficult for us from a theoretical perspective, and I would have to change my hat and put a very political one, because I really have no idea how Russia is going to react or work like. I thought maybe internal, there would be internal pulls to what Putin is doing, because many people don't want this war in Russia. Young people don't want to fight for this war in Russia. So I think we need an internal revolution of people saying, no, we want to be again a democracy, a different democracy from West, that's fine. No one has said we all have to be the same way. But like, unless those internal critical voices raise up and really stop this, I have no idea how it's going to work. Like, sorry, Kevin.
So it's a pretty broad question. I'll start with, what would the future, I yield to my professor colleague on what is the international order going to look like. I'm not such a broad thinker that I can answer that question. I think we will have to deal with Russia in the future. I'm conservative by nature, and I am of the school, the be careful what you wish for school in terms of what comes after Putin. I am in no way confident that an internal revolution would lead to something markedly better, and it could be worse. So be careful what you wish for on Russia is where I will leave that. On the earlier question, sort of the Russian pretext for this invasion, the sort of first off, the promise of NATO never moving eastward is not a thing that is written down anywhere.
Exactly.
It's not. It isn't an agreement. Talking about the commas, forget about commas. There was no sentence written down there anywhere. So I don't know what happened in the internal conversations, but I know that if that is the pretext that the Russian pretext for this invasion that you want to latch onto, okay, but Russia also used 7 or 8 other pretexts at the same time, which are all sort of contradictory, right? They have also said that Ukraine isn't really a country, so we're not invading anything. It's just part of Russia that we sort of forgot about for a little while, and now we're going to go back and take it. It is a country, but it's run by Nazis, and we need to kill the Nazis. They have used just an enormous range of pretexts so that they can find one way to convince everybody that what they're doing is right. And ultimately, I think the actual reason that they're invading is, well, there is really just one person who is responsible for the invasion, which is Vladimir Putin. I have a really difficult time believing that he made this decision to invade Ukraine based on what he feels is a promise that was broken with Gorbachev, who he doesn't like anyway, rather than what I think his actual motivation is a way to sort of burnish his legacy and reinvent himself as sort of the new father of a Russian empire that he feels very nostalgic for. This is his choice, and while he'll try to convince us that it's for one of many other reasons, it's I think just his personal glory that he has done this for.
So thank you very much. I think we have 5 minutes left, enough for Sonia to get to her taxi. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for your questions. I think it's been a very lively conversation. And again, I invite you to participate in the competition and to watch the other sessions on esglobal sites. So thank you very much. And thank you, of course, for your contribution.